Hi guys and girls, I hope you're all doing well today. Bear with me as I'm losing my voice here a little bit, but we're going to start Chapter 5, Section 1, Preludes to the Revolution. The notes for Section 1 will cover key concept 3.1.1a, colonial rivalry intensified between Britain and France in the mid-18th century as the growing population of the British colonies expanded into the interior of North America, threatening French Indian trade networks and American Indian autonomy. Cover key concept 3.1.1b, Britain achieved a major expansion of its territorial holdings by defeating the French, but at tremendous expense, setting the stage for imperial efforts to raise revenue and consolidate control over the colonies. And lastly, 3.1.1.c. After the British victory, imperial officials' attempts to prevent colonists from moving westward generated colonial opposition, while native groups sought to both continue trading with Europeans and resist the encroachments of colonists on tribal lands. Before I get into the notes, I want to teach you a good acronym to remember about the year of 1763, which is where our Chapter 5 and Time Period 3 picks up. 1763 is a turning point year, or a watershed year, in relations between the colonists and Britain. So the acronym you need to remember is PEEP. The first P stands for Pontiac's Rebellion, which I'll talk about here shortly. The second letter, E, stands for the end of the French and Indian War. The third letter, E, stands for the end of salutary neglect, which is basically the British stop ignoring the colonies and take a more first-hand approach in governing and taxing the colonies. And the last letter, P, Proclamation Line of 1763, which we'll also cover here. So keep that in your back of your mind while we cover these notes, and we'll revisit the acronym at the end. All right. So as I said, Section 1 is Preludes to Revolution. So we're looking at picking up at the end of the French and Indian War. We're going to look at the political diplomatic consequences, the financial consequences, and the consequences for the colonist and Indian relationship. So let's start with the political and diplomatic consequences. So we have the three major countries involved in the French and Indian War: Britain, Spain, and France. Well, Britain is obviously the biggest winner. It secures its dominance of India. Its presence over the coast of Africa and the Caribbean was enhanced, gained territory. Spain ceded Florida to Britain. And lastly, and most importantly, it eliminates France as a major North American power by having to cede Canada and its claims to the lands east of the Mississippi River to Britain. Next, we have Spain, who was allied with France, however. So they're kind of in the middle here as a winner and a loser. They do receive New Orleans and French claims to land west of the Mississippi River as their compensation for their support during the war. However, as I mentioned, they do have to cede Florida to Britain. And then lastly, France was most definitely the biggest loser of the French and Indian War by having to cede Canada and its claims to lands east of the Mississippi River to Britain, and then New Orleans and west of the Mississippi River to Spain as compensation for their support. However, they are able to hold on to rich sugar-producing islands of Guadeloupe and Martinique in the Caribbean. Next, we have the fiscal consequences of the French and Indian War. The debt incurred during this war would leave several countries, especially England, in deep and severe debt. As I mentioned, France lost territory, but they also lost the wealth-producing slave-trading island of Gorée off of the coast of Senegal. And because of this accumulation of debt by the British, as you can see in the graph here, where the two red arrows meet, you see the spike in debt starting with the French and Indian War and then continuing after. So in 1764, the British Parliament is going to ask their North American colonies to pay, quote-unquote, their fair share of the war's cost. They believe that since the majority of the war took place in the colonies, that the colonists should hold some fiscal responsibility. Lastly, we have the consequences for colonist-Indian relations. Results for the Indians was a disaster. In that they were no longer a European rival to take advantage for each tribe's well-being and security. So now they cannot ally themselves with the British against the French and vice versa. Before having that being able to pit the Europeans against each other gave them leverage in negotiations and allies. Even for the British allied Iroquois, the costs were high. Their power with the British, as I mentioned, came from the fact they were needed as allies against the French and the French Indian allies. So this is going to lead to what we call Pontiac's Rebellion, also the first P in our acronym. So Pontiac is pictured there, a Ottawa chief, united many of the Indian tribes who were allied with the French and launched an attack against the British forts, capturing and taking control most of the Ohio region. British fought back, forcing Pontiac to sign a peace treaty, which he signed once he learned he would receive no aid from the French. So he appealed to France for aid, hoping that they would reignite the war in the colonies, but they, after the French and Indian War, declined to do so. As a result of Pontiac's rebellion, we have the Proclamation Line of 1763. So the English didn't want any more conflicts with the Indians west of the Appalachian Mountains. So they passed the Proclamation Line of 1763, which prohibited any English settlements west of the Appalachian Mountains. As a result of that, you're going to cause anger amongst colonists. You're going to have, by the 1760s, a group known as the Paxton Boys, and others, but Paxton Boys specifically were frontiersmen of Scots-Irish origin in central Pennsylvania who wanted to settle west of the Appalachian Mountains, so they form a vigilante group to retaliate against the Indians there. They believed that Indians were an inferior race that needed to be eliminated. So I said, I want to come back to the acronym PEEP at the very end. So again, 1763 is a turning point year. So we have Pontiac's Rebellion against the British. So that first P is actually going to cause the second P. Because of Pontiac's Rebellion, British Parliament passed the Proclamation Line of 1763. And then we look at the end of the French and Indian War because of all the debt accumulated in that war. That's going to cause the second E, the end of salutary neglect. So the P causes the P, and the E causes the E. All right, so that's a wrap with Section 1, guys and girls, and I will see you in class tomorrow.